Welcome, sentient beings. I'm Shamika.
And I'm Jess, and we are SciFi in real life.
That's right. This is the show using science fiction stories to help us talk about contemporary tech issues.
And today's sci-fi story is an oldie but a goodie, Flowers for Algernon, the 2000 version. We have a special guest who will be helping us unpack today's ethical dilemmas. But first, before we dive in, remember, there will be spoilers. So if you don't want to know what this short story and this movie is all about, then go watch it or read it and come right back. So in Flowers for Algernon, Charlie Gordon is a 32-year-old man with an IQ of 68 who is chosen by a team of scientists to undergo an experimental surgery designed to boost his intelligence. The experiment was originally performed on a mouse named Algernon, who, after getting the surgery, was able to outperform Charlie at simple cognitive tasks like finishing a maze. After Charlie undergoes the experiment, he quickly gains intelligence and becomes so smart that he soon discovers a flaw in the research that led to his intelligence. A flaw that ultimately leads the experiment's effects to reverse themselves, which causes Charlie to revert back to the person he originally was.
And now to introduce our awesome guest. Lindsay Diamond is a fellow graduate student in the Information Science Department at CU Boulder. She earned her PhD in biomedical sciences with a concentration in molecular biology and has worked in the fields of technology, science communication, and vaccine education and advocacy. She's back in school and pursuing the next chapter of her career focused on mis and disinformation. So let's let her in.
Hello!
Hey! Welcome!
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's great to have you here. Welcome to Sci-Fi IRL.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So one thing that we need to do before we dive into our ethical dilemmas is, of course, our ethical dilemma dance. All right, so today we have two main ethical dilemmas, and I'll be introducing the first one, research ethics. The notion of ethical responsibility is mentioned explicitly in this film. At several points, Charlie, after his procedure, asserts that Dr. Strauss had an ethical responsibility to him as a participant in his experiment. The larger question here is, what is the ethical responsibility researchers in general have in human research? With technology moving at the speed of innovation, what rules and guideposts are in place to ensure that people are treated well and are not harmed during the process of experimentation? Let's take a quick moment to talk about one of today's ethical dilemmas, research ethics. Amy Bruckman wrote a chapter on research ethics in HCI for the book of Ways of Knowing in HCI, or Human-Computer Interaction. There, she writes, researchers create three primary risks. First, they risk harming their subjects. Second, they risk disturbing the environments they're trying to study, as researchers often do. This may also reduce the group's willingness to cooperate with future researchers. And third, they create a risk of serious consequences for their institution if ethical violations occur. Bruckman also outlines the history of research ethics, starting with World War II. After the Nazi experiments of World War II shook society, the scientific community committed to outlining how human subjects are to be treated during research. Bruckman explains, the Nuremberg Code was drafted in the wake of the Nuremberg war trials of 1949, the trials that revealed the atrocities of the Nazi Germany experiments. This established the basic principles that subjects should provide voluntary consent and be free to end their participation at any time. Further, the experiment must yield fruitful results for the benefit of society, and unnecessary risks should be avoided. Bruckman then points to another atrocity, the Tuskegee experiment. Bruckman went on to explain, when this atrocity came to light, a commission was created which led to the creation of the Belmont Report in 1979. The Belmont Report remains the primary statement of principles of ethical research on human subjects today. It has three main principles. The first is to respect for persons. This means to treat people as ends in themselves, not means to an end. The second main principle is beneficence. Do not harm and maximize possible benefits and minimize possible harms. The third main principle is justice. Distribute the burdens and benefits of research equally across society. In Flowers for Algernon, Charlie's life did not get better from the procedure, and his newfound intelligence was fleeting. Not only that, there was a chance that he would regress further than where he started. Was Dr. Strauss's research ethical?
And now to introduce our second ethical dilemma for this episode, we have Lindsay, our guest host. And Lindsay, why don't you just go ahead and take it away?
Thanks so much. Yeah, so I think for our second ethical dilemma, the question relates to genetic engineering, which is a little bit different than what was presented in the movie Flowers for Algernon, but I think it's certainly a relevant idea to what was presented. And that is, I like to think of the old adage, just because you can doesn't mean that you should. I think this comes up a lot in scientific research because I think scientists and clinicians come from a good place. I say this as someone who trained for a long time in science, but we can easily sort of become a victim of this tunnel vision of how to fix things. And suddenly everything becomes a hammer, and you don't necessarily talk to the communities involved, or you're not talking to the people who are involved. You're just trying to fix things. And so I think in this particular case, one important thing with genetic engineering is to differentiate what's called somatic gene therapy or somatic genetic engineering versus germline genetic engineering. And so when we talk about somatic gene therapy or engineering, this is when we alter the cells in the body that don't produce eggs or sperms, so you can't pass these alterations on to subsequent generations. This is different from germline gene therapy or genetic engineering, where this is happening to egg cells or sperm, and you actually can pass these alterations down onto subsequent generations. And so I think a lot of, when we think about gene therapy or genetic engineering these days, obviously one of the big things that comes to mind is something like CRISPR-Cas9 or CRISPR 2.0. And I'm going to test myself here because I swear no matter how many times I try to learn this, I'm going to try my best to say what it is. So CRISPR is short for clustered, regularly interspaced palindromic repeats, which is, I did it. Science is many things, but full of difficult jargon is certainly one of them. But CRISPR is an incredibly precise tool, which is certainly better for how we move forward with things like gene therapy or genetic engineering, but it also opens up a huge host of things that we could alter. And I do want to give a shout out for women in science, because this past year, the 2020 Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded to Emmanuelle Charpentier and Jennifer Doudna for their work in the CRISPR system. So shout out to women in science. Even though there's a host of problems with Nobel Prizes, it's always nice to see women earning them. So, but I think when we talk about this precision tool, one of the big things that I think about in terms of the just because you can, doesn't mean that you should, is treating illness, treating disease, versus what we might call enhancements, right? So in theory, you could use these things to make these sort of quote unquote designer babies. And I think we can all agree that there's a lot there to unpack about what that would look like. In the movie, Dr. Strauss says to Charlie, none of these babies will ever have to be like you were. And that hit me hard when I was watching the movie, because it's, I think what an egotistical place to be, to assume as the researcher that it's just as simple as that. And I think that more than anything is sort of the window into the ethics here is, is it so bad to have a baby, be born like Charlie? What does that mean, that none of these babies will ever have to be like you are? And I think that gets back to this idea that scientists and clinicians, while it comes from a really good place, are often trying to fix things and solve problems. But I think sometimes that good place is also an uninformed place.
Okay, so let's dive into discussion. Was the experiment done on Charlie ethical? What do y'all think?
No. Not even remotely. There was no consent, like no real consent, because he didn't actually know what he was getting into. And then the entire time they were just parading him around like some trophy without actually like treating him like a human being. And also the experiment was flawed and it could have killed him. It's just like so many problems with this experiment.
Yeah, that's all great points. And even though they got consent from his mother, what does that mean when you as the participant didn't actually give the consent, right? So if that means of the situation like they had in Flowers for Algernon, or another situation where someone else is giving consent on your behalf for whatever reason, what does that mean for you as the participant? Because they clearly didn't explain to Charlie all of the implications of this research and what might happen, the benefits, the possible harms. And then also Dr. Strauss, when he invites, right, Charlie to Chicago for the conference, it's really more of a, I made you. It's more like a God complex that Dr. Strauss has that is forcing him into this, trying to force Charlie into this position, like you're saying, of them parading him around. And Charlie calls him on it. And in that moment, I was like, oh, snaps. Because Charlie was like, I'm smarter than you, aren't I? Say it! And I was just like, oh my gosh. But yeah, I felt like in the end as well, they put the onus on Charlie to try and solve the problem that they created with their research. What?
It is super meta in a way, though. Like, if that was possible to be able to like create research that is able to create something to finish your research, like the concept of that is really weird. Kind of meta.
Yeah, absolutely. Ugh.
Well, so I have a question for the genetic engineering piece of all this, because CRISPR is something that has intrigued me for a few years now, and also really just scared the hell out of me. And so I'm wondering, really, I guess maybe like Lindsay, this is a good place to start with you. Like, I'm wondering if CRISPR is good. Because I'm so scared of like designer babies becoming the norm, so much so that like it's even more ostracized than like it is today to be non-normal, whatever that means.
Non-normative.
Non-normative. That that it just ends up like wreaking havoc on society for those who are non-normative or not using CRISPR. But like, are there benefits to this technology? Is it worth it?
I think that's a great question. I like to think of it as it in and of itself is neither good nor bad. It's really how it gets used. It's a tool, and I think for the most part, the people who, created it and have brought it to what it is today had the best interests of humans, plants, organisms at heart. But of course, like many other tools, which serve a purpose but could be used harmfully, this is no different than that. Can it be good? Of course. I think, a great example of that is currently right now there are clinical trials going on where they are using CRISPR to help patients who have sickle cell anemia. There is a woman, Victoria Gray. I think she's the first woman. She's from Mississippi, but she was participating in a clinical trial in Tennessee. She has sickle cell anemia, one of the forms of sickle cell disease, which can be an incredibly debilitating illness. And so she, fully consenting, right? So aware of her condition, aware of the risks, was very excited to participate in a clinical trial where they used CRISPR to actually alter her blood cells to produce what's called fetal hemoglobin, which is a form we don't produce beyond development. But the hope was that if they could get her cells to produce fetal hemoglobin, that she would start to produce normal, healthy hemoglobin, and that would allow more oxygen to flow through her body and hopefully prevent some of the debilitating effects of sickle cell anemia. And so she is now, I believe that began in July of 2019, and she is thriving. She, any interviews I've ever seen with her, she's, talks about how she hasn't had severe pain. She hasn't had to have to use, opioids or strong pain medication. She hasn't been to the emergency room. She hasn't had blood transfusions. And so, this has absolutely changed her life for the better, according to her. I can't make that statement for her. But from all of the interviews, she's been able to participate in her children's lives, in ways that she hadn't been able to before. So, do we know the downstream effects? We don't yet. She knew that going into the clinical trial, and she was happy to, be a part of it. But we don't know what this is going to look like long term. We don't know yet if there will be any side effects from this procedure. But in this particular case, I think I would call CRISPR, a helpful and a good tool in the case of possibly being able to treat something like sickle cell disease. But, while that's a really good example, obviously the example out of China where they did genetically alter, the twin babies, there's, we don't know yet what's to come of that and whether that was ethically or morally a correct thing to do, obviously is a big topic. And I think that raises the big concern is that sometimes these tools become available to use before there are governing bodies and, ethicists and committees and groups of people who could come together and decide the how we use this tool, when we use this tool, when we can't or shouldn't use this tool. And so I think that's perhaps the danger of something like CRISPR is, it sort of rose exponentially in possibility as a tool, perhaps exceeding the pace at which the ethicists and all of the people who could help us make good decisions could wrap their arms around it. I will do my best, yes. I've been out of this realm of science for a little while, but my understanding is that the CRISPR type of genetic engineering was done to prevent HIV, the possibility of HIV transmission. And this is a polarizing topic in China. There's a lot of shame around HIV. And so the idea was that you could sort of design these babies to minimize HIV transmission. And one of the downsides, which I admit to not fully understanding myself, is that somehow in this process it would potentially make them less susceptible to getting the full response from something like the West Nile and influenza vaccines, I believe. So there were like these sort of ethical dilemmas of like, which is worse, or, which thing do we design around and against? And so this was the first time that CRISPR's been put into, like a germline situation where, some would call this a designer babies. And so obviously there was a lot of backlash from the scientific community, the technology community, the ethics community, because as it stood, there was sort of an unagreed agreement that we weren't at a place where we were going to be, designing, babies with this technology yet. But this particular scientist went ahead with this experiment. And there are a lot of questions about that. Obviously, he lost. I don't know exactly what happened to him professionally. I believe he lost his position. But beyond that, I have to say I'm not sure. But this was, a huge storm in the scientific and ethics communities about, we probably should have seen this coming. Somewhere this was going to be done because it could be done. But I don't think anyone was honestly ready to come to terms with the fact that it was going to be done so quickly, and what the ramifications are going to look like long term.
Yeah, we've talked before in another episode about the speed of innovation and how that affects the ethics of the situation of whatever's being created or innovated on. So how do we balance the innovation of science and technology with the responsibility, the ethical responsibility that we have to society? Like, what does that look like?
That's a great question. It's interesting. I have to admit, I have not been a huge science fiction fan. Like, that's not been my genre of film or books. But I think in the back of my mind, I always hoped that maybe like science fiction could sort of serve in this role a little bit, because there are such creative geniuses, who operate in the science fiction space. And I've always thought perhaps if we paid a little bit more attention to the things that people predicted might happen in the future, that we could have been having some of these, discussions ahead of time to be a little bit better prepared. And I'm not saying this didn't happen. I genuinely don't know. But I think, I feel like so often something will happen in current time and somebody will point back to a science fiction author, story, film and say, look, we knew this was coming. And I think probably some of that comes to people just not taking science fiction seriously enough, right? Because you could imagine someone pitching to the NSF, I'm going to write a grant to, put together a consortium of people who are going to sit down and talk about science fiction and figure out ethical debates about how to predict forward. But in reality, it sort of seems like that's maybe that's what we need, because, I think science fiction does a great job of predicting things. Obviously, it doesn't get everything right purposefully sometimes. But it's hard to know what will be possible coming out of, science and technology. And the pace is just astronomical these days, and I think it's difficult to keep up. I will say one thing I think that would help, as someone who was in the STEM track for my entire life, is that I don't think I ever took an ethics course. I don't even think I took a course where ethics was even the central theme of the course. And I think that's pretty telling about how we train scientists and engineers, at least in this country. And I think, part of the reason that I was drawn to information science is because I saw that it was a lot of people who think like scientists, but have a far stronger spine of ethics. Like, yes, we can do this, but should we? And what are the ramifications if we do? Or what are the ramifications of the things that have already been done? So, yeah, I think, I don't like to pick on education because I love education, but in this regard, we don't do a very good job of training engineers and scientists with the backbone of ethics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, Shamika and I are definitely big fans of science fiction and science fiction to help with tech ethics. Oddly enough, I don't know where that came from. But if you are interested in learning a little bit more, you meaning the viewer, interested in learning a little bit more about teaching ethics through science fiction in classes, we'll link somewhere one of our previous videos with both of our shared PhD advisors, Casey Fiesler, who does exactly that. And yes, it's very needed.
Yes. And Lindsay, I will be the primary investigator on that NSF grant to use science fiction to study the ethical implications of future technologies. I would love to lead that team.
Let's do this. In our spare time, we'll write a large NSF grant.
Yes.
And so speaking of the things that we cannot predict generally with technology, and let's go back to CRISPR-Cas9 here. When I think about CRISPR, I think about this one YouTube video I saw years ago on, I think the channel is called Kurzgesagt or something. I can never pronounce it right, but we'll link that video again somewhere. And in that video, they're talking about how people might use genetic engineering like CRISPR to do things that are not helping with stuff like sickle cell anemia, but instead like giving people bigger muscles, making them taller, making their hair more luscious, making their skin softer, things like that that are more like, that's where like this designer baby concept comes from, I guess, but like things that are more in terms of like beauty and like less for health or utility. And so I'm wondering if that's actually like a pragmatic like possibility, if that's actually something that people are concerned with, that like only the rich people will just be like superhumans, or if this is just like another science fiction dystopic thought experiment.
Yeah, I think if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have said, oh, like, this is way off. Like, I think that we should be having these conversations, but this isn't coming anytime soon, and here we are. I do think that this is a very realistic part of the discussion that needs to happen. Maybe it's at the forefront ethically, because this goes back to, sort of what I alluded to earlier about this idea of like treatment versus enhancement. I mean, personally, and so I'm only going to speak for myself here, but, if we're talking about using this kind of tool to treat debilitating illnesses or diseases, it's harder for me to come up with a counter argument. I think there are some, but I think it's more challenging to come up with a counter argument. But when we're talking about like, I want my baby to have blue eyes or, stronger muscles, whatever you want to call it, like this is where the ethics get, I think, very murky. Because essentially you're deciding features, for another human being. It doesn't matter that it's a subsequent generation. It doesn't matter that it's your child or a child that you and another partner can produce. Like that is changing the nature of some other living thing, and not because of illness or disease, not something that would actually empower them or prevent pain. We're talking about something that's, cosmetic or aesthetic. I think that's really tricky. I think about like comparing it to plastic surgery, right? So someone who's going to have plastic surgery for a cosmetic or aesthetics reason is usually old enough to be making that decision themselves. They know the risks, or hopefully they are informed of the risks, and then they continue on to make, this decision. But we're talking about something that like before a baby is born, at the point of development, you're altering features, you're altering, and yes, it might be aesthetics and it's not like who that person is, but it could drastically alter the experience they have in life for better or for worse. We don't know. And that's, I hate to sort of use the term, but that really gets into the playing God, concept. And I would hope that makes a lot of people very uncomfortable.
Yeah,
it does.
Well,
at least right here.
Yes, I was going to say the people who jump to that and are excited about that, those are the people to worry about.
And I think, Jess, you brought up a really good point about, there are already so many systemic issues that we still need to resolve. Like this wouldn't help any of them, right? Like this is just going to drastically blow up, these societal and systemic issues that, we are just barely beginning to tackle, not even well most of the time. And I think this obviously would, certainly feed into this idea that essentially wealthy people would have the advantage to any of these tools far before, anybody else in society. And I think that is probably the closest to this movie because, if you knew that there was a chance you were going to produce a Charlie, which, personally, there's nothing wrong with that, but using the movie as an example, I think there's that question, like, he was already a grown person by the time they, did this procedure on him, right or wrong, he was still like a living being in and of himself. Whereas now we're talking about, making these alterations before somebody even grows into themselves. So yeah, it's scary. It is.
Yeah. And just you saying that, Lindsay, reminds me of the quote from William Gibson, where he says, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. So with certain technologies, the wealthy get it first, right? And they get all the perks and benefits of it. And for other technologies, the poor and minoritized, people of color, indigenous people, etc., like these marginalized groups, they get the technology first, and it's usually for harm or to take advantage or to extract from them something for the benefit of wealthy people or for other people. So this notion of using something like CRISPR for creating designer babies, that's going to be a future that gets unevenly distributed by access to assets to be able to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, and even taking that a step further, like the thing that probably scares me even more than everything that I've already said scares me the most, but the thing that actually scares me the most about all of this is that there could be a point when it starts to become so normal for wealthy people and maybe even like the middle class to use this technology to fix whatever minuscule flaws, you know, air quotes on flaws here, that like humans have, that it becomes almost like unethical to not use it. And so people who choose to not use CRISPR on their babies or on themselves for their babies or things like that, those people are then like shunned by society for not having genetically like fixed, again, air quotes, their children and themselves. And that's another ethical problem too, because then we're just fundamentally changing like the human race in a way that somebody has deemed is better or worse.
Mm-hmm. You know, there's an interesting corollary to that, although obviously it has differences. But I mean, you know, the first test tube baby had as much ethical firestorm, you know, I think, as CRISPR, right? I mean, people thought that that was just an absolute abomination that people would create a baby in a test tube, air quotes. And look how far, I mean, now, you know, to your point, it's almost like it became unethical to not allow people to produce children when the technology and the science was there for in vitro fertilization. So in a relatively short period of time, essentially, we went from, you know, test tube babies being this abomination to, you know, IVF being essentially a completely normalized procedure. Now, though, of course, again, when you look at the expense of IVF, herein lies the same situation where the only people who really have access to IVF are people who have the money to spend, you know, on IVF, because this is not a covered procedure. So while I think in some ways, you know, in vitro fertilization has a lot of similarities to the conversation we're having, although obviously very different. But you have this, what once was, you know, an abomination became completely normalized, and perhaps even unethical to not allow people to, you know, to have children in this way. But also it's completely limited as a technology, as a procedure, to people who have the money, you know, to spend on. And you constantly hear stories about people who, you know, max out their credit cards. They have to sell their houses. You know, they go into unbelievable debt, you know, just to produce a child. And so while I think in some ways you could call in vitro fertilization a miracle, it absolutely is. But look at, like, we haven't solved the fact that it's still completely limited to those who can afford, you know, to have access to it. There's also one of the things about this movie, it also made me think of the deaf community a little bit. So, you know, there are clinical trials and ongoing studies about looking at tools like CRISPR-Cas9 or CRISPR 2.0 to try and solve some forms of hereditary deafness. And I think this gets back to the, you know, scientists and clinicians wanting to fix things, because, like, it just happens, right? Like, they see this thing that could possibly be solved by a tool, so why not try to solve it? But the deaf community is an incredibly rich and vibrant culture, and they are a linguist minority group, and they don't, you know, many members of the deaf community have absolutely no interest in having their deafness fixed, air quotes. And so this movie made me think a lot about the deaf community, of which I'm not a part of and certainly not an expert. But, I think there's been a lot of coverage about, what does it mean to produce this solution if the majority or many of the people in a community actually don't want the output of the research at all, and it makes you wonder, like, do these scientists and clinicians talk to the community? Like, did anyone stop and ask, the deaf community if they actually want, this to be fixed? Because, I think I think it's emphasized as though it's a deficit when in reality it's just a difference. And so I think there's a lot of questions about what are we, which problem to solve? Do we solve, quote unquote deafness, or do we solve all of the systemic problems in place, that can make it, that much more challenging for someone with a disability to survive and thrive in society? So I think, there is this little bit of like, back to that idea of the tool, the hammer, yes, maybe we can solve hereditary deafness with a tool like CRISPR, but should we? Do deaf people want to be, their deafness to be solved by CRISPR? And so I think these are, interesting questions.
All right, well, I guess that sums up our discussion for today. This has been really riveting and also has broken my brain a little bit, but thank you so much, Lindsay, for coming on and talking to us about biology and about CRISPR and research ethics. This has been really great.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fantastic. I really enjoyed getting a chance to talk to you.
And now's the time when we kick you off the call. So waving you off, but bye, Lindsay.
Bye. Well, that sums up this month's episode. We hope this gives you all something to think about.
And as you may well know, at the end of every episode, we ask a trivia question related to something that we covered during our sci-fi analysis. If you think you know the answer, send it to us in a tweet. The first person to get the answer will be included in our shout out in the next episode. And today's trivia question is, who wrote the story that the 2000 made-for-TV film Flowers for Algernon is based on?
Think about it.
If you like this content, feel free to click that like or that subscribe button and share it with your friends.
And we'll see you next time for Sci-Fi in Real Life. Well, good night and good luck, humanity.